Hello, welcome to PhillyCam's special election coverage. And this is What's at Stake 2020, where we take an insightful look into what's happening in the elections, both on a local level here in the state of Pennsylvania and nationally, of course, in this big presidential election year. So I just want to let everybody who's tuning into us know that we are simulcasting on PhillyCam TV. So you'll see us there, and you will hear us on WPPM 106.5 low power FM in Philadelphia, and on some other platforms that PhillyCam offers as well. So we'd like to thank you for joining us for this special coverage. My name is Dennis Link, and I am typically the host of a co-host of Hall Monitor, which is a radio program that airs on Wednesdays from 6 to 7 p.m. And I also do some stories for PhillyCam Voices, which is the weekly news program that happens on the TV side. So my co-host is here, Larry McGlynn. I'd like to bring Larry in right now. How you doing?
I'm great, Dennis. How are you?
I'm doing great, and it's good to be with you for this special coverage. And knowing that we're going out there both on TV and radio, which I don't think we've ever done before.
Mm-mm. No, it's great. And we have a great show today. We have a lot of things we're going to talk about. And we have a very special guest, somebody I'm very excited to have on with us, somebody who I think is one of the best reporters in the city. And that's Denise Clay from the Philadelphia Sunday Sun.
Hi.
Hi, Denise.
Hi, Dennis. Hi, Larry. How are you?
We're great. Thank you so much for being with us today in what is a very strange time to be doing this job.
Oh, you ain't kidding.
So the first thing I'd like to talk about from a national standpoint, we're looking at probably the most consequential election of our lifetime. Mm-hmm. On what key issues do you think people will be basing their vote? Are there still undecideds? Are there people who are still looking at issues? What are we talking about here in terms of the electorate and what their choices are going to be?
Well, probably the biggest topic that anyone is talking about, if we're all honest with ourselves, is still the coronavirus. Anything that takes over 200,000 people out of the equation is going to be something that folks are focused on. And as a result, the economy is also going to be something we're looking at, because those two things are connected. How the coronavirus is making businesses do things differently, how the coronavirus is making people be employed differently or employed at all in many cases. So I think that it all kind of begins and ends with the coronavirus. But, there's all these other issues that are kind of in the mix as well. You have criminal justice reform. You have the Affordable Care Act. You have healthcare as an issue. Apparently, the day after Election Day, the Supreme Court is going to hear a case that, if depending on how they decide it, could get rid of the Affordable Care Act and cause a lot of people to not have health insurance. So that's something that's coming up a lot in this election. Those are probably the three biggest things off the top of my head I can think of, but I'm sure that for other people, there may be other things that they're thinking about. Now, if you asked if there were any actual undecided voters. There are people who say they are undecided voters, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And the reason why I'm not 100% sure about that is because you've been given so much information to make a decision by now that if you are truly undecided, I'm kind of wondering what you're going to need to make a decision. Because I don't think the information that's available to you is going to change all that much.
And this is one of the things that Dennis has been talking about, the idea of the shy Trump voter. Maybe somebody who is going to be a Trump supporter but doesn't necessarily want to admit it. Is that what you're thinking, Dennis? That maybe some of these so-called undecideds really are Trump voters?
Yeah, so there have been some polling that's been indicating that there's probably it's 15, 20, possibly 25%, depending on which poll you look at, of people who say that they're that they are uncomfortable reporting their preference in the presidential race. And of those people who say that they're uncomfortable reporting that, there's many more Republicans indicating that than Democrats. So that's where it makes you wonder when there's actually a question about who have you decided to vote for. You know, these people who say that they're uncomfortable releasing their choice or telling people, they may also not be giving the straight scoop to the pollsters, and that would be disproportionately Republican over Democrat, just based upon the polling answers to that previous question I mentioned. So it's a tough thing to really factor in. So I don't think, I agree with Denise. I don't think there's a whole lot of undecided left. You know, and you said it, Larry, there's too much information out there. I don't think that it's really about winning over people. I think with the polls, it's about finding out who's really for which candidate. You know, because it just, you know, is Joe Biden really up, as he looks in some polls, by double digits? Now, Hillary Clinton, 2 weeks out, there were polls in 2016 saying that she was up double digits. Now, those polls tightened up over time, and we'll see if that happens regarding Joe Biden. I mean, you know, right now, I think the Real Clear Politics average of these polls is like 8 point something that he has an advantage. So it's really sizable. But, you know, we have to see, you know, will that come down? Will there be any, you know, revelations in the next couple of weeks? The Republicans are trying to make hay with the, you know, the Hunter Biden scandal. I don't know that really has anything to say about that, you know, Joe Biden slipping a point in the last week. That might just be statistical noise. So I think it'll be interesting to see, you know, if this lead is really as high as it is. I don't think it is, but I think Joe Biden definitely has an advantage, shy Trump voter or not.
Well, you make a good point, Dennis, about people not necessarily wanting to say out loud who they're voting for. And that's an important thing to note, because there were a lot of people that, as it turned out, were being less than honest with us in 2016. If we're honest with ourselves, there were a lot of people who said, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, or I'm not going to, or I'm undecided, or I'm not going to vote at all. And as it turned out, they voted for Trump. So, you know, I look at polls and I take them with a very, very, very large grain of salt, because folks are not necessarily entirely honest with you. Voting is still a very personal decision. And it's not a decision you necessarily want to share with your friends and family, because I spend entirely too much time on social media. I admit that. But one of the things I'm finding in my social media travels is that you have families breaking up over this election. And if you think that you could possibly lose the respect and love of your loved ones over who you vote for president, that may not be a decision you want to share with people.
And one of the things that I wonder about, you know, if you would have asked me this question a couple months ago, I would have said no way. But is there a small group of Trump supporters who are going to be switching their vote or staying home this time? Because maybe with what they've seen in the last few months, they've been disaffected?
Well, I've seen some buyer's remorse. And there's a lot of it to be had, because a lot of the stuff that Donald Trump promised people, I mean, I'm not talking the outlandish stuff about like the walls, you know, separating us from Mexico and Mexico paying for it and all. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about the healthcare stuff, the making the economy better for me stuff. That hasn't necessarily happened. Coal has not come back to Appalachia. You have a lot of people who voted for Trump who are still living hand to mouth, if they're doing that, thanks to the coronavirus. So there's some buyer's remorse out there. You might see some changing. I don't know if it's going to be a lot of changing, because all you have to do is watch television and see one of his rallies, and you see that there's still thousands of people willing to go out and in many cases risk their life and health to attend one of his rallies. So the support is still there. You still have that hardcore base of Trump supporters that, are the people he was talking about when he said he could go out on the Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and lose no support. So those people are always going to be there. It's the people who thought they were getting the Trump of The Apprentice, or the people who were like, I want somebody who's not a politician, I want something new. Those people are now questioning the decision they made in 2016. So some of them may drop off, but the more hardcore ones, he's got them for life no matter what he does.
Yeah, and Denise, to your point, I think one of the surprises of the 2016 exit polls was the fact that Donald Trump had apparently won white women nationally 52%. And that was a humongous shock to everybody, particularly since there was a woman running for president, would have been the first woman president in American history. So I think that was a huge surprise to a lot of people. And Denise, when you talk about those people who care about the kitchen table issues, how is coronavirus affecting my life? How, what's the economic situation? I think the ones that are most moved on that are the ones that were that surprising category, white women. And I think you're going to see, and maybe have seen already, an erosion of that in the polls. Now, it appears that white men are holding strong with Trump, and it could be for a variety of reasons. There's a talk about this masculinity effect, and people like the fact that Trump projects as a strong personality, a lot of bluster, and personality-wise, that actually comes across better to men than it does to women. But I think that that 52% from the exit polls, and again, that's not an exact science, but that I can't possibly see standing, considering a lot of the other things that have taken place over the last 4 years, which you mentioned.
Honestly, there's a part of me that wants to be optimistic enough to agree with you on that, Dennis. But then there's a part of me that says these women knew what they were putting in office back in 2016. They knew that they were putting in a man that had no respect for women. They knew they were putting in somebody who may not know exactly what they were talking about, but they did it anyway. And while I would like to think that they've looked at the last 4 years and said, maybe this was not the best decision I could have made, something that we don't talk about when it comes to Hillary Clinton, and it kind of bore itself out when you look at Pennsylvania and who won and lost in 2016. Among the Democrats, all of the other Democrats that ran for row offices, Josh Shapiro, Tom Wolf, and others, they all won. The only two people that lost in Pennsylvania in 2016 were both women, Hillary Clinton and Katie McGinty. And we never talk about, or we don't talk about enough, the fact that the role that sexism had in a lot of this, even among the 52% you just mentioned. Because one thing I have learned over the last 4 years is that the only people who are less inclined to vote for women in positions of power than men are other women. And I think that in a way, that's kind of why Donald Trump is still going to have these women's ear, because not only did Joe Biden put a woman on the ticket, he put a Black Asian woman on the ticket. So you have not only the possible change of having a woman in the nation's second highest office, you have the possibility of a woman of color being in the nation's second highest office. And for some folks, particularly the folks who voted for Trump because they felt that having a woman in office was one change too many after 8 years of a black man. That could be a bridge too far for them.
So if you're a Trump supporter right now, and we've touched on this a little bit, aren't you disappointed with this presidency? Most of the key promises have not been realized. The border wall, no progress. He has not repealed Obamacare. His trade deals have been disastrous. So if you're a Trump supporter, what do you reference when you're advocating the president for a second term?
You know, that's a good question, but probably the thing, again, it goes back to that core group of people who are never going to shy away from him no matter what he does. And to them, even though in actuality, none of what they really wanted has been realized, some things have. Like, they like somebody who, you know, comes off as a strong man. They like someone who likes to, you know, basically curse out journalists or talk about locking up their political opponents, or, you know, let's put these women back in their place. They like people like that. So he's their kind of guy. And the fact that basically whoever becomes the next president is going to spend the entire first year of their term apologizing to the rest of the world doesn't really matter to them.
Yeah, and I think you know, part of the way that Trump viewers, whether or not they support him, I think has to do with perception also. So I think that, like, I saw a Gallup poll that recently said that you know, they polled you know, people of different parties how serious you thought that the coronavirus situation was, and this was recently, and I believe it was 71% of Republicans indicated that they didn't feel that it was a serious problem at all. Like, it was something that, you know, if you catch it, you know, it's not going to be a big deal. You know, if you know, the fatalities are going down. That was what was bearing out in this poll. So I think if that is the take that most Republicans have, most Trump supporters have, when they look at his handling of the coronavirus, which has to qualify as his single biggest weakness in this campaign. If people are saying about his biggest weakness that, well, we don't think it's that bad, then there isn't really going to be much of an impetus for them to shift away from that. So I think it's people's perception of an issue that is really strongly coloring how they look at Donald Trump. So I think another thing is on economics. I think that in terms of the the trade deals and the manufacturing jobs coming back, the coal jobs, that really did not happen much, if at all, let's say in the state of Pennsylvania. I can't speak for a lot of other states, but it was very small there, if a benefit at all. But yet the unemployment rate, went down, and even at this point in the pandemic, it's under 8%, which, so I think a lot of people are saying, well, at least I have a job. I might have lost my job and it came back. So I think it's the perception that people have that may not quite match up with the reality, but these perceptions are what are causing Trump supporters to stick with him by and large, just because of the way that they view the world versus the way a Democrat views the world at this point in time.
Right.
Perception becomes reality. That's like media literacy 101. Perception becomes reality. And for a lot of these people thought that they were voting for the man who fired people on The Apprentice. And, showmanship has been a hallmark of this administration. They've been really good at it. And, if nothing else, if nothing else, that is what will get them back into the White House. The showmanship, the perception of strength, the perception of competence, even when the reality doesn't necessarily bear that out. And it's going to be interesting to see if Trump does get a second term, how long he's going to be able to play that card with a world that has pretty much seen this act before and has, in many cases, really had enough of it.
Now, Dennis, you've been doing some things with the polls. What are you seeing right now?
Well, in terms of the polls, there's a lot of skepticism about how accurate they are. So the one thing that can help give us some clarity is the fact that we are in the election season right now. There are actual votes being cast early. Now, we don't know, we don't know who they're voting for, obviously, but we do know that a lot of states track this by demographics. So you do know how many Democrats requested a ballot. You do know how many of those requests were returned, when they received the ballot. You do know how many Republicans have done the same. You know how many people, in a lot of cases, voted early. So I think right now it's a chance that you can sort of move away from the murky science of the polls and more towards something that's on solid ground. In terms of what's actually happening on the ground with actual voters. So one thing that I did was I looked at a resource that what it does is it where it doesn't have exact demographic breakdowns, because not all states have that. It does a lot of work in modeling to try to figure out, okay, of these folks that have applied, are they more likely to vote Democrat? Or are they more likely to vote Republican? And there's this huge mass of big data that goes behind them, and in order to try to make these determinations. So what I'd like to do is focus on the battleground states, because as you know, I mean, the popular vote, and we've seen this a couple times in fairly recent history, not only 2016, but in the 2000 election, where the winner of the popular vote, a Democrat in both cases, did not win the Electoral College. So in looking at this, I don't want to look at the impact of early voting, mail-in voting in national terms so much, because we don't care if California is running up the score in terms of early voting and mail-in voting, because it really isn't going to matter towards the electoral count. We can pretty much assume a state like that is already in the Democratic column for Joe Biden. So what I want to do is look at 15 battleground states, and I'm not going to go into exhaustive detail about all of them, but what I want to do is show how early voting, which everyone presumed going in was going to heavily favor the Democrats, how does it look at this point in time on October 20th? So what I'd like to do is pull up my spreadsheet on that, and then hopefully the share screen function will work. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is talk about where this data is from. So there's this company called Target Smart, and they're a Democratic political data and data services firm, and they provide political marketing and technical services. So what they did was they created a dashboard called Target Early, and it explores in-person and absentee voting trends. So the resource is updated every day with new activity that's been collected from state and county election offices. So what it does is it aggregates early vote returns and links it to a national voter registration database that it maintains. So staff is able to report on the political composition of the individuals who have voted early or requested a ballot. So, it does internal analysis for paying clients, but it's decided to make this data available to the public to keep the organization's principle that voting rights should be celebrated, protected, and expanded. So I'm not trying to advertise for them. I'm just saying to people that this is a resource that has a lot of credibility in terms of trying to figure out, how voting has been, stacking up and how voters model, so we can try to predict how it might have come out. So what I'm going to do is, the first thing I'm going to mention is there was a Pew survey that was done on September 8th, 2020. and it polled, I forget how many people it was, but it asked, are people, are you going to vote early or vote by mail, or are you going to vote on election day? And the results were very stark. So for Democrats, it was 75% of respondents said that they were going to vote early, in person, or absentee ballot, and only 37% of Republicans said that. So the difference there is Democrat plus 38. So by 2-1, it's supposed to be Democrats outvoting Republicans early, and that's a substantial amount. Now, you can turn it around and say that on election day, you might see 2-1 the other way, with Republicans having the advantage. So the important thing for Democrats to do in this early voting season is to run up the score. They need to bank lots of votes so that there's an opportunity to hold off what should be a red wave on election day. I will mention that there in this polling was 20% unaffiliated. So what I'm going to look at right now is the fact that nationally, where does it stand? So according to the Target Smart, Target Early returns, where do things stand for Democrats? Right now, nationally, the returns are 51 for Democrats and 38 for Republicans, and then 10 for unaffiliated. So if you compare that to the way that polls were suggesting people would vote, the Democrats are only plus 13 as opposed to plus 38. So if you look at the polling, Pew said 37%, Republicans, and they're at 38% in the early voting. So they're right about where you would expect. The Democrats are way lower than they would hope for this particular point in time. Now, I have read a lot of stories that talked about there is tremendous, early vote turnout, mail-in voting. And that is true relative to past elections. And it is true that Democrats have a big lead in this. But the question is it a big enough lead? So they talk about in football, when a team is favored over another team, there's a point spread. And the favored team is supposed to be able to cover that spread. And right now, if you're talking in with that analogy, Democrats have a lot of work to do to build up that advantage closer to the 2-1 that they should have. So when you look at the state by state, I'm going to start with some of the ones that were pie in the sky, best case scenario. This is an obvious sign of Joe Biden landslide. I want to start with some of the states that Democrats thought might be vulnerable. So when you look at Texas, okay, you look at Democrats are at 41, Republicans are at 50 in returns, and unaffiliated is 9. So Republicans have a +9. I tried to account for the unaffiliated and where they're going to go by looking at recent polls. So Republicans actually went up. They're +11 at this point in returns. Now, again, this is not a poll. This is actual voting. This is a model based on actual voters and what's been happening out there. It's also not a small sample size because 40%. We're at 40% of what had voted in Texas in 2016. So we have a sizable amount, the biggest of any battleground state. And right now, Republicans have an edge there. So I think any thought that Texas might go Democrat this cycle, it just looks highly unlikely. Now, another one that we've been following, Larry, is Georgia, because there was a recent Quinnipiac poll that indicated that Biden had a surprisingly big lead there. But if you look at the voter modeling based upon actual voting, the Democrats do not have a very big lead. They have a 1 percentage point lead over Republicans right now. When I factor in the unaffiliated, it's Democrat +2. So when you talk about the fact that Republicans are going to have this wave on election day, if you're a Democrat hopeful for this state, you need to have a much bigger lead than that. In fact, I think it needs to be at least over 10 and probably closer to +20 for you to consider being able to pick it off. So I think Georgia is one that, again, it was more of an optimistic scenario for Biden, but I just don't see how it's going to come through. So the next one I want to look at, which was optimistic for the Biden campaign, was Ohio. So Ohio went Democrat for Barack Obama, both times. And Joe Biden's hoping to win it back after Trump got it in 2016. So far, it's not looking good for Democrats there either, because they're even with Republicans, as of October 19th, which was yesterday. So again, unless they have a big lead there, and unless they increase it in the next 2 weeks, it seems unlikely at this point that they'll be able to win that, considering the Republican in-person election day advantage. So to go to the next one, Arizona. Now, Arizona is a little more optimistic for Democrats. So despite the fact that no Democratic presidential candidate has won it since 1996, it's been trending closer in presidential elections to the Democrats. The Republicans have been losing ground. So where does it stand right now? So the Democrats do have a +10 advantage, 52 to 42. When unaffiliated factored in doesn't really change it. So that is more of an advantage than we saw in the other states of Texas and Ohio and Georgia. But again, when you're thinking that Republicans are going to be 2-1 on election day, a +10 right now is just not good enough. I think they're going to need to do better than that in this early voting period, these next couple of weeks, if they want to be able to take Arizona. The next state I want to talk about is Wisconsin. Okay, so Wisconsin had gone traditionally Democrat, and then Donald Trump was able to steal it, just barely, but he stole it in 2016 away from the Democratic column. Now, the way things look here, it's very similar to Arizona. So Democrats are 43 to 34, so that's a +9. I factor unaffiliateds breaking more towards the Democrats, so that gets Democrats up to a +13. It's similar to Arizona, but again, I think that it's not wide enough of a margin at this point in time for the Democrats. So I think the Republicans have an advantage in the early vote at this time with Wisconsin. So when you take a look at another state, which was crucial to Donald Trump in 2016, and will be crucial again, is Michigan. Michigan is a big area of concern for Democratic early voting. Right now, they're modeling only a +5, 43 to 38. Now, when I factored in affiliateds, and there's a lot of unaffiliateds, they're at 19. I factored in it's a Democrat +9 when you bring them over to the Democratic side. But again, it's just like Arizona. It's just like Wisconsin. It's not enough to hold off a red wave if things stay the same in early voting as they are now. And Michigan, it's huge because that gives Donald Trump so many more options. And if Joe Biden wins it, he kind of slams the door on some of those pathways. So taking a look at at Minnesota. So this is one where Donald Trump talks about it a lot. And he lost it by, I think it was about 1.5 points in 2016. He keeps talking about being able to take it back, or, for the first time since 1972 for a Republican. And he has visited Minnesota. But right now, the Democratic advantage there in early voting looks much more robust. Right now, they're at +20. And when I factor in the unaffiliateds, I see them at Democratic +24. So that's one that, even though it trended more red last time, I just don't see it for Donald Trump this time. So moving on to, let's see, the next one is New Hampshire. Donald Trump's talked a little bit about this. The Democrats barely won it. They won it by 0.3% in 2016. But again, you're looking at a +28 in terms of Democratic vote margin right now. So I think that looks a lot more healthy for them. I don't think they need to worry as much about losing that state and its 4 electoral votes as well. Colorado, similar story. So the last time a Republican won this it was George Bush in 2004. And it's been trending Democrat, and so the Republicans actually made it a little closer in 2016, but right now my Democrat advantage there is +23. It's not going to be enough to help Republicans in Colorado. Virginia, I've never really considered this a swing state. It's there because it is considered. It's a little closer. It's +15. If you factor in unaffiliated, it gets to +19. But when you look at the polls, the Real Clear Politics average is it's 11. for Biden. And I just don't see any surprises there, despite the fact that the early voting is within range for Republicans. So looking at another one, Pennsylvania. Now here's a big one. Here's a big one. Pennsylvania so far. Now again, it's only 11% of the vote that was tallied in 2016, but Pennsylvania is killing it in the early voting. They're killing it with mail-in voting, and this is, I think, what we're most aware of. Larry and Denise. This is what we've been able to say. So you can see that right now it's 71 to 24. That is a plus 48 advantage in Pennsylvania. So that is one swing state that may come right off the board for Donald Trump, which means he's going to need Michigan. He's going to need Wisconsin. So I think that's a really important one to focus on, especially since that's our home state of Pennsylvania. Now, Florida, another huge one. Basically, there's no path to election, in my view, if Donald Trump doesn't win Florida. Right now, that's looking at a plus 15 for Democrats. And I think it's still healthy for Republicans, if with that in-person election day. I would tend to think that 15 is not enough for Democrats. It's sort of leaning Republican. Right now, the Real Clear Politics average only gives Biden a 1.4 advantage, which is, within that margin of error. So Trump could win that. And in fact, I think it would probably tilts to him a little bit at this point. And then the next one is Iowa. Iowa is pretty much the same in terms of the plus number as Florida. So right now it's another one where Biden is only winning Real Clear Politics average by 1.2. Last time Donald Trump won it by 9.5 percentage points. I still tend to see this as a Trump state when all is said and done, based on the way early voting looks right now. And then when we get to a couple other states, North Carolina, Trump doesn't have to have it, but he could really use it. Right now, that's Democrat plus 17, a danger zone for Trump, but still very manageable. And then when I look at the last battleground state, Nevada, this is one that it's in the same range. It's Democrat plus 16. Republicans lost it. I think so Trump lost it by 2.14. And that's a toss up, but it could go either way. So when I take a look at the so there's 270 to win is a website. It's an interactive map that allows you to kind of take a look. Can you guys see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. So here's where I'm going to end it. And if you give Florida to Trump, okay, that takes him up to 264. If you give Iowa to Trump, that takes him to 270, and he doesn't even have North Carolina yet. And Nevada's still hanging around out there. So here's the thing. This is just the way things look with 2 weeks to go. Democrats can and will, in all likelihood, build up their early vote advantage, but they need to do a much better job in Michigan and Wisconsin, because the way Pennsylvania looks, if it continues looking good for Biden and you take away Michigan and or Wisconsin, Trump's chances of winning all of a sudden plummet. So that's why I think those are the two states. If you're Democrats, you better be devoting more attention in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin and Michigan. And to me, that's where I think things stand with the early vote. And the thing I like about it is we don't have to talk about polls anymore. We can actually talk about votes. So thank you guys for bearing with me. And I hope that adds a little bit more information to what we think could happen or where we think the polls might be off. I think Michigan polls, where I think Biden's up by like 6 or 7 points, I think that might be so there might be some problems there.
Yeah, a soft number.
Well, actually, my question was because of how Donald Trump has talked about mail-in voting and early voting. Could that be depressing Republican turnout in those states?
Well, I think the way it looks is, according to the Pew poll, Republicans were supposed to be at around only 37%, and now again, if this factors in mail and early voting, but they're coming in the national averages around 37, 38. So they're doing about what was expected. It's the Democrats that are actually behind right now. Now they're ahead in terms of votes, but in terms of the percentage that they need to cover the spread for what's coming on election day, that's where I'm saying the Democrats are doing well, but they're still behind where they want to be.
Do you think that some of these Senate races, like in Iowa and Arizona, could have like a reverse coattails effect? Because that Iowa Senate race is favoring the Democrat now, and I would think after Joni Ernst's disastrous debate performance last week that the Democrat might have a clearer path. And in Arizona, we have Democratic Senate candidate, I think, up by 10 points right now over the incumbent Republican.
Now, that's a good point, Larry, because I actually was trying to look at Michigan. So when that looked surprisingly good in terms of the early vote for Republicans, when I looked at that, you have James versus Peters, James being the Republican versus the incumbent Peters. And there have been polls that have James like a lot closer in the Senate race than Donald Trump was polling in the presidential race. And I agree with you. I think that when you pointed out Iowa and Arizona, those are ones where the Republican senator's chances look really bad, and they may be indicative of weakness. And when I talked about how, you know, those Arizona and Iowa are in play, they're kind of like not outside of the distance for Republican election day turnout. They're close. So I think that those Senate races are another indicator of that.
Races, one that's interested me in particular, it's the Jamie Harrison, Lindsey Graham race. How is that looking in terms? Well, I guess, what are you hearing about it from a polling standpoint? And also, do you think that Harrison doing as well as some polls have him doing, could that influence South Carolina in terms of the presidential map?
I don't think so, because, and I don't think I've ever been to South Carolina. But I do think that South Carolinians are still going to vote for Trump. Their support for Lindsey Graham's opponent has less to do with Trump and more to do with Lindsey Graham, in their opinion, and this is, again, just my reading of it, being more of a fraud, changing his stripes to fit the Trump administration. And I just think that that's the greatest sin in South Carolina that you can make. And again, this is just me reading about South Carolina trends and the character of the electorate there. That's my take on it. Depending on which polls you believe, it's either pretty close to even or Graham has up to like a 5 or 6 point lead. I have seen some polls that had Harrison slightly ahead, but that I could see it as a toss-up. I mean, I think that's the category we could put it in right now, considering the significant finance goals that Harrison has reached. $52 million, which I think is a record for a U.S. Senate race. But yeah, I don't know that that's going to affect South Carolina. I think South Carolina is the reddest of the red states in the country.
Yeah, and there have been, I think one thing that's been strong for Harrison is the fundraising. You know, so he's had record fundraising, and I think that's been an advantage. And Lindsey Graham, and Larry, I think you've talked about how inauthentic he looks to his own voters. I think he's just more or less a weaker Republican candidate, and there's a very strong Democratic candidate, and those two things coming together. I think it's the Senate races are, and the Senate's going to be really important when you look at the fact that if Donald Trump does win, but then the Senate flips, he's not going to be in a position to do much, if anything, with both chambers of Congress against him. So it's almost like, what's the point? The Republicans almost have to do both, retain the Senate and the White House from their standpoint.
And can we see a situation where a Democratic Senate candidate can win, yet Trump wins the state? Is that possible or likely in some cases?
Yeah, I think we're going to see it. I'm not exactly sure which states at this point, but that seems highly likely. So, and the Senate is harder to gauge because there aren't as many polls that are taken. So that's the problem. And especially in certain states, it's really hard. So for instance, Montana is considered a close race, a toss up in Senate terms. And I think there's only been 1 or 2 polls on it the entire election season. So I don't know, is Daines for the Republican in good shape? There was one poll that said he is, and then there was another poll that said Bullock, the Democrat, was right in the ballpark there. So which one's true? You only have 2 polls to go from. So I think that's the problem with Senate races too, is you just don't have a lot to go on unless it's one of the really hotly contested ones, like you guys pointed out, with South Carolina, and then Iowa and Arizona. But even those are trending Democrat now very strongly. Denise.
Hi.
We lost you for a second there.
I was also going to ask about, and I don't know if you covered this while I was off the air. My family is from Kentucky. And while I have relatives who would like to take Mitch McConnell out to the backwoods near Lexington and leave him to his own devices for the bears and other animals, I was curious about that race. Because again, Amy McGrath may be a fighter pilot, but she's also a woman. And we're talking a woman in a southern state against an incumbent. So I guess, what are you seeing there, if anything?
I don't know, Larry, what you think. Because I still see him as having an advantage there. Now, she has the benefit of a lot of money that came into her race. So she's actually raised money and is competing strong in that respect. But the polling just hasn't really indicated much of a danger for him. But she has been able to run a lot of ads and campaign hard against him.
And I would think that you might see the polls tighten a little bit, because all people are remembering from the debate they had last week was when they talked about the Senate's reaction to COVID, he laughed. And that's the way it's being spun. And that's been one of her biggest commercials since then. You might see some tightening in that race, but I still think the polls have him plus 12 right now, something like that. It's one of those things where, and we've talked a lot about this on this show, that, people can hate Congress, but they're going to vote for their own congressman. They might hate the Senate, but they're probably going to vote for their own senator. And somebody like Mitch McConnell, who, as the Senate Majority Leader, he wields a lot of power and he can bring a lot of things home to Kentucky. And I think that's, so if there's any building project, if there's anything going on there, I'm sure it has his name on it somewhere and people know that. So I don't know that somebody with his reach and his power is necessarily beatable unless it's a complete bloodbath. But the polls aren't showing that right now. Like I said, maybe we give it another week and we see where we are. But at this time, I really don't see McConnell being beaten.
So Denise, I'm curious to ask you. So because you mentioned earlier in the program how in Pennsylvania, the statewide races of we're talking Attorney General and Auditor General and Treasurer, those all went Democrat, whereas in the process, Trump won the state of Pennsylvania on the presidential level. talking about how people were loyal to him, but they were not necessarily loyal to down ballot people. So I guess I wanted to ask you, how do you see these respective races? Because I got to think that the Attorney General with Josh Shapiro is in a pretty good position. And I know that in the Auditor General's race, Nina Ahmad, who's from Philadelphia, and she's a woman of color trying to become the first woman of color to win an executive office in Pennsylvania. She has a lot of funding on her side, and certainly is going to draw well from Philadelphia, which has a lot of votes. And then you have Joe Torcello as the treasurer. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you see these races? Do they all become a Democratic sweep again, or is there potential for Republicans to break in anywhere there if Trump does well?
Well, I think that name recognition helps a lot in terms of the down ballot races in Pennsylvania. I think Nina Ahmad, having also run for lieutenant governor last time around, she put herself out there. She's got some name recognition, and you're right, she does have some serious money behind her, so that helps. And she also has Philadelphia, which the only time that I didn't see the conventional wisdom of their, how Philadelphia and Pittsburgh goes the state, was in 2016. I think that is going to play the same way here. And the same thing with Josh Shapiro. Where he may have a problem is you've got some people who think that he's only going to stay Attorney General long enough to run for governor next year. And he's going to have to convince people that that's not his modus operandi. But I think he'll win. Joe Torcello will probably win because, let's face it, unless you do something really, really heinous as the treasurer of the Commonwealth, folks will usually give you a second term. It's not one of those offices. It's like the treasurer of any organization you belong to. It's a job nobody wants, but it's among the most important. And as long as you don't mess it completely up, you can keep doing it. But what we need to look at in terms of how this whole race shapes out, particularly in Pennsylvania, is voter turnout and whether or not it can be sustained, because next year, you have the governor's race, and then the year after that, you have a Senate seat that's up. So it'll be interesting to see how voter turnout, remains either up or down when you look at those races as well, especially when it comes to the governor's race. Now that Pat Toomey has said that he's not running for anything else. So it'll be interesting to see, how that whole primary shapes up and whether voter turnout is impacted by it.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. Both the governor and that Senate seat, being wide open like they're going to be. And I think that was one of the things that, as far as Torcello as the treasurer candidate, his opponent has been trying to dog him about, hey, you're not going to, become treasurer and then stay in the office. You're going to want to do something else and maybe run for the Senate seat or something like that. So she actually tried to get him to sign a pledge to voters that he was going to stay all 4 years if he wins, which is really odd for an opposing candidate to try to do that. So I think that you're going to see, you're going to hear a lot of talk, and you're going to see maybe a little bit of maneuvering behind the scenes next couple of years.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see who ultimately makes the run for governor. I mean, right now, if you're a Democrat and you're not trying to put up Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, I question your judgment, because he's been pretty good at his job. He's got some national name recognition, which also brings money with it. And, he's a rising star. He's someone who, for all intents and purposes, should be in the Senate right now. So, he's kind of got the inside track on that. But I just want to see who the Republicans put up, because the Republicans, I think, on some level, were counting on Pat Toomey wanting a job. And now that Pat Toomey has said he doesn't want any job after 2022 that involves politics, that leaves them, kind of scrambling to see who they can put up. So, it's going to be interesting to see who that is. If there's a Republican that, is strong enough to be able to run that race. And it's also going to depend on how Trump does in Pennsylvania. If Trump wins Pennsylvania again, then all the people who have been hitching their star to Donald Trump can, come out of the woodwork for governor. If he gets smacked down, and that's what a lot of the polls that I'm seeing are saying, he's going to get smacked down. If he gets smacked down, you have a whole lot of people that are going to be wondering, what do I do now? My benefactor got smacked down. And whoever I run against is going to tie him around my neck like an albatross. So, what do I do now? How do I pivot so I can actually make that move if I want to make that move?
Right. Well, I have to head out for another event. But thank you both so much. Dennis, always great being with you. Denise, thank you so much for being on with us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem, because I actually have to go to the same event that you're
right. Right.
All right. Well, I'll finish up, you guys, and it's been a pleasure being on the program with both of you, especially Denise. It's great to have you on the program for the first time.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This was fun.
Great.
And we're going to bring you back.
Oh, please do. I'd be happy to come back.
All right. Thank you, Denise.
You're welcome.
So we only have a couple minutes left in the program, and boy, we've covered a wide range of topics. And the one thing I did want to get to before we sign off is the possibility of Democrats taking the Pennsylvania State House. So in order to do that, they would need to flip 9 seats, and so we have a local state rep, Malcolm Kenyatta from 181st District, representing the North Philadelphia area. He's been on a flip PA tour, and he's been going all around the state, stumping for different Democratic candidates, even in red type areas, in order to try to flip the House. So right now the Republicans have an advantage, and they've had it for basically the last 10 years. But a flip would be important in terms of funding. So a Democratic legislature would be much more favorable to sending funding from Harrisburg, from the Pennsylvania state coffers, to help Philadelphia, to help Pittsburgh, to help major cities. And then, the other thing is a situation like with a gun law, where Philadelphia wants to enact its own gun laws, and it can't get approval from the legislature. So this is why the control of the state house is really important. It's almost as important, really, as who controls the house on a national level in Congress, because this has a very direct impact on your life. So what I'd like to do is kind of talk about that a little bit. The Democrats are targeting races in Montgomery County. There's 3 there. There's 4 in Bucks County. There's 2 in Delaware. And then there's 2 in the Dauphin-Harrisburg area. So these are areas where candidates have done very well in the past. Democrats have done well, made big gains in the midterms in 2018 and going forward. The problem is that the GOP also has seats that it has targeting where it has a great chance to do flips. So the problem is, when you look at the fact that there's a lot of seats up for grabs, there's a lot of vulnerable ones. The Cook Political Report, they're still listing the House as leans Republican, simply because although the Democrats are competitive for flips in a lot of races, so are the Republicans. So this is something that'll be interesting to watch. And Larry and I are gonna do that going forward. So thank you for joining us on this election special. What's at stake, both here in Pennsylvania and in the nation. Thank you for joining us. And on behalf of Larry and Denise, we thank you for tuning in.